Francisco was always a man of simple habits. At 72 years old, he maintained an almost monastic routine. He would wake up early, drink black coffee without sugar, read the daily newspaper, and take a short walk around the neighborhood where he had lived for over 40 years. He had lived alone since the loss of his wife, but he never complained about being alone. He was a gentleman with a calm walk, a firm gaze, and a discreet smile, the kind that goes unnoticed in a fast-paced world. What few people knew was that behind his worn-out pants and faded button-down shirt was a respected businessman, owner of one of the largest construction companies in the region, with dozens of projects signed in his name. But he was never one to show off. He didn't wear expensive watches, nor did he care about driving imported cars. He took pleasure in seeing things working, well-done projects, happy employees, and satisfied customers. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel to follow other real and inspiring stories like this one. There are a lot of good things coming. That Monday morning, Francisco left home with one goal in mind: to withdraw 10 reais from a bank in the city center. He had forgotten his wallet at the last construction site he had visited, and with no money in his pocket, he decided to go to the nearest bank. He didn't use mobile apps or care about modern things. He preferred to take care of everything in person. He was wearing a pair of worn-out shoes, cotton pants, and a linen shirt that was already frayed at the shoulders. When he entered the bank, he had the serenity in his eyes of someone who had seen a lot in life. But to other people's eyes, all they saw was another poor, lost old man. No one there had any idea who he really was, and they didn't care either. He approached the checkout line with his usual calm, holding the crumpled paper with the number on it between his fingers. The air conditioning was too strong for a hot day like that, and the plastic benches seemed harder than ever. A girl in high heels and a tight dress looked him up and down and whispered something to the man next to her, who chuckled. Francisco pretended not to notice. Over time, he had learned not to return evil looks. Even so, each glance pierced through him like an arrow, silent but accurate. When his number was called, he approached the counter with a slight smile, greeting the attendant with a sincere, "Good morning." She barely looked up from the screen. "How much?" she asked dryly. 10 reais, he replied just as calmly. She snorted. 10 reais? Did you come all the way here just for that? The question was filled with judgment, but also with disgust. Francisco kept his gaze calm, like someone who has seen the world spin many times. "Yes, my dear, I need to catch a bus." She laughed disdainfully and looked back, catching the attention of a colleague who was also amused by the scene. Embarrassment took over the room, and Francisco could feel the eyes of other customers turning to him, some with pity, others just curious about the embarrassment of others. A man behind in the line commented loudly, "Those old men should use ATMs and stop bothering others." Francisco said nothing. His silence, however, began to carry the weight of decades of dignity, now being trampled in front of strangers who knew nothing about him. And for the first time in many years, he felt a lump in his throat, not for himself, but for everyone who passed by that place. Every day, Francisco was still standing at the counter when the manager appeared, visibly bothered by the line that was beginning to form. He was a young man in a fitted suit, with meticulously combed hair and an anxious look of someone who confused authority with arrogance. "Is there a problem here?" he asked without even looking at Francisco, addressing the attendant directly. "He wants to withdraw 10 reais, she said, crossing her arms as if she had just revealed a crime. The manager rolled his eyes and took 2 steps forward, approaching Francisco. "You can use the ATM over there in the corner. This is priority service, not for any nonsense." Francisco tried to explain that he didn't know how to use the machine and that he only needed a small amount to pay for the ticket. But before he could finish his sentence, the manager interrupted him with an impatient gesture of his hand and a raised tone of voice that made half the agency turn around. "You are in the way. Go over there, or come back another day." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Even those who had been laughing before were left speechless. Francisco took a step back, startled, and at that moment the manager, impatient, pushed him lightly by the shoulder as if removing an inconvenience from the path. But the slight push was enough to unbalance Francisco, who fell backwards onto the cold floor of the agency, hitting his elbow and head hard. A murmur ran through the space. Some laughed, others just looked and looked away. No hand was extended, not from the attendant, nor from the manager, nor from any of the customers. Francisco stood there for a few seconds, trying to regain his breath, his pride, and his reason. He didn't cry, nor scream, nor demand anything. He got up on his own, with effort, and adjusted his shirt. The lump in his throat was now turning into something denser. It wasn't anger, nor revolt. It was a silent, almost sacred feeling that something needed to change. And he knew that would start there. Mathematics. Francisco left the agency without saying a word. The sun was still strong outside, but he barely felt the heat. He walked slowly to a nearby park bench, sat down, and remained there, staring at the sidewalk. People hurried past, some with headphones on, others talking loudly, and no one could imagine what that gentleman with the serene expression was thinking inside. He thought about the parents who saw their children being treated with contempt, the retirees who could barely withdraw their benefits without being humiliated, the women ignored because of their clothes, the black people watched inside stores. It wasn't just about him, it was about all of this. And maybe, after so many years building things for others, it was time to build something that would really change something from the inside out. Still sitting, he picked up the simple cell phone he was carrying and called his trusted lawyer, a gray-haired man named Cesar, who had been with him for more than 2 decades. "I need to talk to you today," he said, his voice firm. Cesar realized right away that this was no ordinary request. They arranged to meet at the office that afternoon. When he arrived, Francisco told him everything in detail. He spared nothing, the looks, the laughter, the fall. Cesar listened to everything in silence, as he always did, but at the end of the conversation he asked, "And what do you want to do?" Francisco adjusted his glasses on his face and answered in a tone that mixed pain and purpose. "I want to buy that agency, the whole thing, and I want to change what happens there. If I'm going to leave a legacy, let it be this, to show that respect doesn't depend on appearance, and that dignity, even when stepped on, can rise stronger." Cesar was well aware of Francisco's tenacity. He was not a man of idle impulses. When he decided on something, it was because he had already thought through every step, every consequence. In less than 2 weeks, the process of purchasing the agency was underway. Francisco didn't just want to acquire the physical space. He wanted the entire operation, the CNPJ, the staff, the internal culture. When the bank discovered the interest of a well-known and respected investor in the construction industry, it didn't put up any obstacles. It was money coming in, and that was enough. No one suspected the real reason behind the acquisition. For everyone involved, it was just another market move, a good deal. For both parties. But for Francisco, it was something personal, a mission. Are you enjoying this story? Then leave a like on the video. It really helps spread this type of content that makes us reflect. On the day the contract was signed, he brought a simple leather briefcase and wore the same pants and shirt he had been humiliated in, not out of provocation, but because he wanted to remember who he was that day. When he left with the papers in hand, he didn't go to an expensive restaurant to celebrate, nor did he post anything on social media. After all, he didn't even use social media. He just called his daughter Mariana and said, "Tomorrow I'm going to visit a special place. Do you want to go with me?" She agreed without really understanding, but she knew her father well enough to know that when he spoke in that tone, something important was coming. The next day, Francisco parked his car, an old, well-kept sedan, in the same spot where he had parked that morning when it all began. He took a deep breath and walked into the agency as if he were returning to the exact spot where the world had turned the wrong way. But this time, with a detail that changed everything. Now, he was the owner of the place. The scene was practically the same. The air conditioning was still too cold. The reception desk, the same faces at the reception. The difference was the posture. Francisco entered slowly, accompanied by his daughter, who was discreetly filming with her cell phone. He went straight to the counter, where the same attendant who had humiliated him weeks before was. She recognized him at a glance, but hesitated, as if she couldn't believe that this simple man, who had asked for 10 rays, was now entering with what seemed to be an entourage. Upon seeing him, the manager hurried down from the second floor with a forced smile, not even suspecting what was about to happen. "Good morning, can I help you?" he asked, trying to hide the tension on his face. Francisco didn't answer right away. He simply took the document that formalized the purchase of the agency from his briefcase and calmly handed it to him. When the manager read the name of the new owner and realized who was standing before him, his smile disappeared. The blood seemed to drain from his face. "Mr. Francisco, I'm sorry if there was any misunderstanding that day. It wasn't my intention," he began to mumble, trying to regain some control of the situation. But there was no way to undo what had already been done. Francisco was direct. "You pushed a customer to the ground, laughed at him, ignored the obligation to serve with dignity. There's no room for that here." And there, in front of all the employees and some customers who were beginning to notice what was happening, Francisco fired the manager. Without a fuss, without shouting, just with the firmness of someone who knows what needs to be done. At that moment, the agency stopped. For the first time, the looks on everyone's faces were not of judgment or contempt. They were of surprise and of a growing curiosity about who that man really was. Francisco looked around, took a deep breath, and addressed the assembled team, still stunned by what he had witnessed. His eyes sought out a woman with gray hair and a low bun, sitting in the back, whom he had noticed the day he had been humiliated. At the time, she was the only one who gave him a respectful look, although she had no power to interfere. Now, he walked over to her. "Your name is Claudia, right?" he asked. The woman nodded, still not knowing where this was going. "That day, you were the only one who didn't treat me like I was invisible, and I've never forgotten that." Then, in front of everyone, Francisco announced, "Starting today, Claudia will be the new manager of this agency, because competence is important, but character comes first." The room filled with murmurs, but no one dared to argue. Claudia put her hands to her mouth, overcome with emotion. She would never have expected something like this, much less from the man who had been mocked by so many. The attendant who had treated him with disdain, the same one who had laughed at him, remained motionless behind the counter, visibly embarrassed. Francisco did not ignore her. On the contrary, he walked towards her with the same calm as always. "You made a big mistake with me, and probably with many others, but you still have a choice. Learn from it, or repeat it until you lose your pride." She tried to justify it, saying that she was stressed, that it wasn't a good day, that she couldn't imagine. Francisco raised his hand, asking for silence. "It doesn't matter who I am. The mistake was treating someone as less just because of their appearance. You'll stay here, but only if you're willing to learn what respect means. You'll go through new training, and if you make a mistake again, you won't get another chance." The girl nodded, her eyes full of tears. It wasn't fear of losing her job. It was the weight of the mirror that someone had finally shown her. In the days that followed, Francisco threw himself headfirst into transforming the agency. It wasn't about painting walls or changing furniture, although that also happened, but about restructuring the entire culture that existed there. He gathered the employees in a room, without a table between them, everyone on the same level. He said that no one was above anyone else, that a client who came in poorly dressed should be treated with the same care as one who arrived wearing a luxury watch. He brought in a consultant in humanized service, promoted discussion groups and active listening, and established an anonymous channel for complaints and suggestions. Some employees resigned, uncomfortable with the new attitude. Francisco didn't object. He preferred a small and committed team to a large and indifferent one. Soon, new professionals arrived, many recommended by Claudia, now the permanent manager, and the atmosphere of the agency began to truly change. The community noticed. People who had previously avoided the branch began to return. The elderly were greeted with coffee and more comfortable chairs. Young people from the outskirts of the city were no longer watched as suspects and were now called by name. Surprised customers praised him on social media, and the story of the old man who became the bank owner began to circulate, without Francisco ever confirming or denying it. He wasn't looking for recognition. What he wanted were results, and these were coming little by little, in the gentler tone of voice of the tellers, in the sincere thanks of customers, in the discreet tears of a man who, one morning, said, "I feel like a person here." That was why he had come back. Not for revenge, but to restore humanity to a place that had forgotten what it meant to serve. And with each change, Francisco felt that in some way he was giving back everything that life had given him, starting with respect. Take advantage and comment below. Have you ever witnessed a similar situation of prejudice? I really want to know what you think about it. Francisco made a point of stopping by the agency at least once a week, but always discreetly. He observed the service from afar, chatted with employees behind the scenes, listened to their difficulties, and celebrated their progress. There was no exclusive room or chair with a nameplate. He sat wherever he had space, ate cheese, bread with the others, and made a point of maintaining the same simple manner as always. Sometimes they even forgot that he was the owner, and that pleased him deeply. Mariana, his daughter, sometimes accompanied him and was impressed by the silent respect he earned. "Dad, why don't you put up a sign with your name on it?" he asked one day. He smiled, "Because those who need to know already know, and those who don't know will feel it." The answer, to her, made more sense than any leadership manual. But despite everything that had been done, Francisco was not satisfied. He knew that real change is not measured in praise, but in consistency. And so he decided to test the agency in the only way he considered legitimate, by going back to square one. He planned everything in silence. He took the same clothes from the first day out of the closet, wrinkled and stained in the pocket. He turned off his cell phone, went out alone, and just like the other time, walked to the agency under the hot morning sun. When he entered, no one recognized him. The line was full as before, and he held a number between his fingers, as if nothing had happened. When his turn came, he approached the cashier and asked in a calm voice, "I would like to withdraw 10 reais, please." It was the same request, in the same place. But what would happen next would show whether everything he had done had really been worth it. The attendant who greeted him was young, probably in her early 20s. She wore large glasses, had a colorful brooch on the collar of her shirt, and a smile that seemed genuine. When she heard the amount of the withdrawal, she showed no surprise or mockery. She simply checked the details carefully and said, "Sure, sir. Just a moment, okay?" Then she offered him water, asked if he needed help with anything else, and handed him the money with both hands, looking him in the eye. Francisco thanked her silently, with a slight nod. He didn't need anything else. That was enough. As he turned to leave, he crossed paths with Claudia, who was walking through the room with a clipboard in her hand, accompanying an intern. She didn't recognize him either, but she said a polite good morning, the kind you say to anyone who enters a place where everyone deserves respect. Francisco left the agency with a light heart, not because of the kindness he had received, but because it was no longer directed at him because of who he was, but because of what he represented, one among many. And now, everyone there was being treated as they should have always been. He walked back slowly, without rushing, breathing deeply, as if savoring the silence after a long concert. When he got home, Mariana was waiting for him to have lunch. They sat at the simple kitchen table, the same one that had been there for over 30 years. "So, did your plan work?" she asked, serving rice. He replied with a serene smile, "It did, and I didn't even have to tell him who I was." Mariana didn't insist. She knew that tone. She knew that when her father spoke like that, it was because something important had happened. And that day, although nothing had been said out loud, everything had already changed. After lunch, they sat on the porch, as they did on sunny Sundays. Francisco took with him a thin folder where he kept some newspaper clippings, personal notes, and an old photo of the first construction project he supervised when he was young, on a dirt lot. Mariana liked to hear his stories, but that day, he was the one who brought up the subject. "You know, daughter, when I was young, I saw my father being treated like trash in a government office. He just wanted a document to get a job. That day, I promised myself that if I ever had any power, even if it was small, I would use it to do things differently." She listened in silence, with full attention. "It took a lifetime, but I think I managed it. Even if it was just in a corner of the city in some agency, at least there, no one will fall to the ground and be ignored." Mariana was moved by his outburst. She knew her father's life story, but she had never heard that story. It was as if, at that moment, all the pieces fell into place. His reserved manner, his simplicity, his lack of ostentation, his patience with other people's mistakes, it all made sense. Francisco did not act out of vanity or revenge. He had a purpose, one he had carried for decades. "I think that's why you never wanted to stop working, right?" she said, with a half smile. Francisco looked at the horizon, where the sky was beginning to change color as the afternoon ended. "Yeah, but now, maybe I can stop little by little. There's still a lot I can teach you, but now, more calmly." The silence between the two was light, like someone sharing an achievement that doesn't need to be celebrated out loud, because it's already engraved on their skin. In the following days, Francisco discreetly received a few letters of thanks. One of them came from a lady named Donna Lucia, who wrote in shaky but firm handwriting, "Today I went to the agency and was treated with kindness, without rushing, as if I were important. I wanted you to know that. Thank you for giving us back our dignity." He read that letter several times. He didn't reply, there was no need to. He kept it carefully in the same folder where the photo of his first work was kept. With each gesture like that, Francisco realized that his plan was having an effect not only on the appearance of the agency, but on the people, the environment and the trust. It was as if a small change was spreading slowly but surely, reaching places he had never imagined. This gave him peace. Claudia also began to provide constant feedback, sharing the progress, difficulties, and touching stories that arose in her daily life. One day, she called to tell us about a client who had come in upset, yelling at the staff. In other times, this would have ended in confusion or yet another case of generalized disrespect. But that day, the team itself was able to welcome the man, understand that he had been the victim of a scam, and didn't know how to resolve the situation. They resolved it together, and the client left crying, not out of anger, but out of relief. Francisco listened to everything in silence and at the end simply said, "That's how we measure whether we're on the right path, when chaos appears, and the response is empathy." She no longer needed to visit the agency every day. She knew that she was now standing on her own 2 feet and with a new heart. What surprised Francisco the most, however, was the invisible effect that this change had. Mariana commented one night that the doorman at the building where she worked had enthusiastically told her about a different agency, where she had opened an account and was treated with a politeness that he had never received anywhere else. She didn't have the courage to tell him that the owner was her father. She just listened and smiled, keeping to herself that silent pride that doesn't need applause. At another time, Francisco discovered that a former employee of the agency, who had resigned shortly after the change in management, had reflected on her attitude and started a customer service course. She sent a shy message to Claudia, saying that she wanted to become a better person and, who knows, one day come back with a different mindset. These small waves, born from a specific action, gave Francisco the certainty that sometimes to change the world, all you have to do is move one piece and wait for the others to start moving. Despite this, he never romanticized what he had experienced. He knew he had been humiliated, that he had fallen to the ground in a place where he should have been welcomed, and that hurt, especially knowing that many would not have the same chance to react as he did. It was a privilege to be able to transform that pain into change. Francisco was aware of this. That is why, instead of holding a grudge, he kept a sense of purpose. He made a point of documenting everything in detail: the approach, people's reactions, employee testimonies, and the concrete results. His goal was to transform that experience into an internal training program that could be replicated in other agencies and companies, a kind of silent but effective legacy. Because in the end, it was no longer about a bank. It was about planting something bigger, something that would continue even when he was no longer around. Over time, Francisco's name began to circulate at business events and forums on good practices, not because of his heritage or the buildings he had left behind in the city, but because of the story that went viral without him wanting it to. A short video recorded by Mariana on the day he fired his manager in front of everyone ended up being shared on social media. Someone found out who he was, and the press soon began looking for interviews, photos, and statements. Francisco refused them all. He didn't want to turn his story into a spectacle. He always repeated the same phrase to those who insisted, "It's not about me, it's about everyone who never had the chance to react." Even so, the impact was already being made. Other companies began to rethink their processes. Small business owners began to look at their most humble customers differently. What started as a push became a silent movement of reflection. Francisco, on the other hand, maintained his routine without major changes. He continued to wake up early, walk around the neighborhood, read the newspaper, and make black coffee in the old kettle that insisted on working. Every now and then, he would meet someone who would say to him, "I know who you are." He would just smile, neither confirming nor denying. Sometimes he would sit on park benches and listen to random conversations about kindness, patience, and service. And that made him happier than any tribute. He didn't seek gratitude. He sought continuity. And in the silence of his simple days, he realized that life has discreet ways of thanking those who are willing to do the right thing, even when no one is looking. That was what kept him at peace, knowing that his greatest work was not in the concrete, but in the invisible that now lived in the hearts of so many people. One day, sitting at the kitchen table with Mariana, Francisco pulled out a folded sheet of paper from the envelope of letters that he had kept for a long time. It was an old letter written by himself years before, at a time when he was thinking about giving up everything. At the time, the company was facing a crisis. He was ill, and he had lost friends due to misinterpreted business deals. "This letter was for when I forgot who I was. But today, I think it no longer serves me," he said, tearing up the paper calmly, as if freeing himself from a weight. Mariana didn't need to ask anything. She knew that gesture meant more than 1,000 words. It was the end of a cycle that, although full of scars, was now closing with purpose. That night, they had dinner together and watched an old movie on TV. Francisco, lying on the couch with a blanket over his feet, fell asleep before the end, as he always did. Mariana carefully covered him, turned off the TV, and looked at him for a few seconds. He wasn't just her father. He was a man who transformed personal pain into collective change, and who taught with every daily gesture that you don't have to shout to be heard or humiliate to be respected. You just have to act firmly, coherently, and humanely. When he went to bed, he felt a calm pride, of the kind that doesn't make a fuss, but warms the heart. He knew that his father's name would never be on bronze plaques or on important avenues, but wherever he went, there would always be someone who had been touched by something he had started, even without knowing it came from him. Pearl, a few weeks later, Francisco returned to the agency. There was no specific reason. He just missed it. He was greeted with a hug by Claudia, who was now managing everything with firmness and ease at the same time. The newer employees treated him with respect, even without knowing the whole story. One of them, young and full of energy, said with a smile, "You're the guy who turned things around, right?" Francisco laughed, shaking his head. "I just turned things around. I came from there, went there, and now I'm back here." The boy didn't really understand, but he smiled back, and so the day went on. Francisco had a coffee in the corner of the room, talked to old clients, shook a few hands, and before leaving, left an envelope with Claudia. "Keep this. If one day they forget why all this started, open it again." When he left the agency, he walked to the corner and stopped for a moment, observing the movement on the street. He clearly remembered the day he fell to the ground, the metallic taste of shame, the pain in his elbow, the muffled laughter of those who had watched. It still hurt, not physically but in his soul. But now, when he looked back, he saw more than humiliation. He saw transformation, and that changed everything. He had chosen not to be a hostage to what had been done to him, but to be the author of what he would do with it. That was what he wanted to leave behind, not a bank nor a code of conduct, but an example for those who came after, so that one day no one would have to fall to be noticed. And that even without knowing it, everyone would get up a little with the story of an old man who only wanted to withdraw 10 reais. That same night, Francisco and Mariana went out to dinner, something they rarely did. They chose a simple neighborhood restaurant where he used to take his wife on their wedding anniversaries. They sat by the window, and while they waited for their food, Mariana asked, "Dad, if you could change anything about that day, would you have done it differently?" Francisco thought for a few seconds, stirring his coffee calmly. "No, it hurt, but it was necessary. Sometimes life gets tough, so we wake up the world. And that's what happened. I woke up a little bit, but it was all I could achieve." She nodded silently, feeling the depth of his answer. She understood that he wasn't driven by revenge or ego. He was driven by something few understood, an intimate commitment to what was right. When they returned home, Francisco went straight to his room and took out a small wooden box where he kept his most personal objects. Inside, among old medals, birthday cards, and a piece of concrete from the first building he had built, there was now a new item, the password from that day when it all began. It was crumpled and faded, but still legible. He picked it up carefully, looked at it for a few moments, and smiled. "It was just a number, but it changed my life." He put it back, closed the box, turned off the light, and lay down with a peaceful heart. Francisco's story didn't become a movie or a book or go viral with his name all over it, but it changed an agency, it changed people, it changed perspectives, and perhaps it planted something deeper in everyone who crossed his path. In the end, his greatest achievement was not the empire he built over decades, but the silent impact he made in just one day. Because, as he himself said, true wealth is not measured by the balance in your bank account, but by the dignity you spread wherever you go. And if this story touched you in any way, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Oh, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories.